But even if the staff thought Miner a possible suicide risk, no restrictions were placed on him as a result of the American information. Some years before, he'd asked for a pocket-knife with which he might trim the uncut pages of some of the first editions of the books he'd ordered. There is no indication that he was asked to hand it back, even with the harsh Dr. Brain in charge. No other patient was allowed to keep a knife, but with his twin cells, his bottles and his books, and with his part-time servant, William Miner seemed still to belong to a different category from most others in Broadmoor at the time. In the year following the disclosure about his relatives, the files speak of Miner's having started to take walks out on the terrace in all weathers, angrily denouncing those who tried to persuade him to come back in during one especially violent snowstorm, insisting in his imperious way that it was his business alone if he wished to catch cold. He had more freedom of choice and movement than most. Not that this much improved his temper. A number of old army friends from America happened to come over to London in 1899, and all asked to come to Broadmoor, but the old officer refused to see any of them, saying he did not remember them, and besides, he did not want to be disturbed. He formally applied to be given some freedom of the vicinage, to be let out on parole, the word he used being rather rare, and meaning essentially the same as the vicinity. The elegance of his language convinced no one, however, and his application was firmly denied. "He is still of unsound mind, and I am unable to recommend that his request be granted," the superintendent wrote to the Home Secretary. Or typed, it should be said. This is the first document in Miner's file that was produced on a typewriter, an indication that while the patient remained in a miserable stasis, the outside world around him was changing all too rapidly. The Home Secretary duly then turned down the prayer. On the form is added a bleak initial notation from the heartless Dr. Brain. "Patient informed, 12/12/99, R.B." His diet ticket shows him to be eating fitfully. Lots of porridge, sago pudding, custard every Tuesday, but bacon and other meat only occasionally. He appears to have become increasingly unhappy, troubled, listless. "He seems unsettled," is a constant theme of the attendant's notes. A visit from Murray in the summer of 1901 cheered him up, but soon afterward the staff at the dictionary were beginning to notice a depressing change in their keenest surviving volunteer. "I notice that he's sent no Q quotations," wrote Murray to a friend. "But he has been very slack altogether for many months, and I've scarcely heard anything from him. He always is less helpful in summer, because he spends so much more time in the open air, in the garden and grounds. But this year 'tis worse than usual, and I've been feeling for a good while that I shall have to take a day to go and see him again, and try to refresh his interest. In his lonely and sad position he requires a great deal of nursing, encouraging and coaxing, and I've had to go from time to time to see him." A month later, and things were no better. Murray wrote about him again. By now there are stories of him putting his back up and refusing to do the work that was wanted. He wrote something about the origin of the word hump, as on a camel, but aside from that, and coincident with the death of Queen Victoria, he lapsed into a sullen silence. Another old army friend writing from Northwich in Cheshire in March 1902 asks Superintendent Brain if he might be allowed to visit Miner, telling him in some distress that Miner himself had written saying that he ought not to, since things were much changed, and that I might find it unpleasant. "Please give me your advice," the writer adds. "I do not wish to expose my wife to anything unpleasant." Brain agreed. "I do not think it would be advisable for you to visit. There are no indications of any immediate danger, but his years are beginning to tell on him. His life is precarious." It was at about this time that there came the first indication that it might be better if Dr. Miner now be allowed to return to the United States, to spend his declining years, as he did seem to be in decline, close to his family. Miner had been in Broadmoor now for 30 years. He was by far the longest-staying patient. He was sustained only by his books. Sadness had utterly enveloped him. He missed the ever-sympathetic Dr. Nicholson. He was perplexed by the more brutish regime of Dr. Brain, his sole intellectual colleague among the Block 2 patients, the strange artist Richard Dadd, who had been sent to an asylum for stabbing dead his own father, had long since died. His own stepmother, Judith, whom he'd seen briefly in 1885 on her way back from India, had died in New Haven in 1900. Age was fast winnowing out all those who were close to the mad old man. Even old Fitz-Edward Hall had died in 1901, an event that prompted Miner to fire off a letter of deep and abiding sadness to Murray. Along with his condolences went a request that the editor might perhaps enclose some more slips for the letters K and O. The news of the passing of his fellow countryman seems to have revived Miner's interest in work a little. But only a little. He was now quite alone, in worsening health, harmless to all but himself. He was 66 years old and showing it. The facts of his circumstances were beginning to weigh heavily on him. Dr. Francis Brown, the distinguished physician in Boston, to whom Murray had written the full account of Miner and their first meeting, thought he might intervene. After hearing from Murray, he'd written to the Department of the Army in Washington, and then to the American Embassy in London, and now in March to Dr. Brain, suggesting that, without Miner's knowledge, a petition be sent to the Home Office asking for his release into his family's custody and his return to the United States. His family would rejoice to have him spend his last days in his own land and nearer to them. But the pitiless Brain did not make the recommendation to the Home Secretary, and neither the Embassy nor the U.S. Army chose to become involved. The old man was to stay put, encouraged only by the occasional correspondence from Oxford, but increasingly dispirited, angry, and sad. A crisis was clearly about to erupt, and erupt it did. The event that in Haydn Church's orotund phrase was the most striking feature in the American's history. Struck without any warning that was heeded, on a cold morning at the beginning of December 1902. Chapter 10. The Unkindest Cut. Masturbate, verb, from Latin, masturbate, plural stem of masturbari, of obscure origin, according to Brugman, for mastitubari, feminine masdo, compare Greek, mexea, plural, virile member, plus turba, disturbance. An old conjecture regarded the word as feminine manus, hand, plus stuprare, to defile. Hence the etymologizing forms manusturpration, mastuprate, mastupration, used by some English writers, intransitive and reflexive, to practice self-abuse. At 10:55 a.m. Dr. Miner came to the bottom gate, which was locked, and he called out, "You'd better send for the medical officer at once. I've injured myself." The words are the first lines of a brief pencilled note that lurks anonymously among the scores of other papers that measure out the trivial details of the life of Broadmoor's patient number 742. Reports of the more mundane features of William Miner's now almost solitary life, his diet, his steadily diminishing number of visitors, his growing frailty, his curmudgeonly lapses, his insane ruminations, are usually made in ink, the writing steady and confident. But this single page, which is dated December the 3rd, 1902, is very different. The fact that it was written in thick pencil sets it apart, but so does the handwriting, which makes it look as though it was scrawled urgently, in a hurry, by a man who was breathless, panicky, in a state of shock. Its author was the Block 2 principal attendant, a Mr. Coleman. He had good reason to be appalled. "I sent Attendant Harfield for the medical officer and went to see if I could assist Dr. Miner. Then he told me he'd cut his penis off. He said he'd tied it with string which had stopped the bleeding. I saw what he'd done. Dr. Baker and Dr. Newt then saw him, and he was removed to the B3 infirmary at 11:30 a.m. He'd taken his walk before breakfast as usual. Also, he took his breakfast. I was talking to him at 9:50 in Ward 3, when he appeared to be just as usual. But he was not, in fact, just as usual, whatever such a phrase might mean in the context of his well-developed paranoia. Unless his act of self-mutilation was an extraordinary reaction to some equally extraordinary event, which could be the case, though there was no proof of it, it looks very much as though William Minor had been planning it for several days, if not for months. Cutting off his penis was, by his lights, a necessary and redemptive act. It had probably come about as the consequence of a profound religious awakening, which his doctors believed had begun 2 years before, or at the end of the century, 30 years after he'd been committed. Minor was the son of missionaries, and he'd been brought up, at least notionally, as a staunch Congregationalist Christian. But while at Yale he'd largely forsaken his religion, and by the time he was established in the Union Army, whether he'd become disillusioned by his experiences on the battlefield or simply uninterested in organized religion, he apparently abandoned his beliefs totally and was content to have himself described, without shame, as an atheist. He was for a while a devoted reader of T.H. Huxley, the great Victorian biologist and philosopher, who coined the term agnostic. His own feelings were more negative still. Since the laws of nature could quite satisfactorily explain all natural phenomena, he would write, he could not find any logical need for the existence of a God. However, over the years in the asylum, these feelings of hostility began slowly to ameliorate. By 1898 or so, his absolute certainty about the non-existence of a God started to waver, perhaps in part because of the strong Christian beliefs of his frequent visitor James Murray, who was the object of Minor's intense and most lasting admiration. Murray may well have discussed the possible solace that Minor might gain from the recognition and acceptance of a superior divinity. Unintentionally, he may have triggered what turned out to be Minor's steadily intensifying religious fervour. By the turn of the century, Minor had changed. He was telling visitors, and formally informing the Broadmoor superintendent, that he now regarded himself as a deist, as someone who accepts the existence of a God, but does not subscribe to any particular religion. It was an important step, and yet, in its own way, it was a tragic one. For in tandem with his new beliefs, Minor began to judge himself by the harsh standards of what he believed to be an all-purpose, all-seeing, and eternally vindictive deity. He suddenly stopped thinking of his insanity as a treatable sadness, and instead took to thinking of it, or of some of its aspects, as an intolerable affliction, a state of sin that needed constant purging and punishment. He began to regard himself not as a sorry creature, but as someone inexpressibly vile, endowed with dreadful habits and leanings. He was a compulsive and obsessive masturbator. God would be certain to punish him dreadfully should he fail to halt his wholesale dependence on self-abuse. His prodigious sexual appetites in particular started to become particularly abhorrent to him. He began to be haunted by the memory, or the fantastic supposed memory, of his past sexual conquests. He began to loathe the way his body responded, and with the way that God had so inappropriately and unjustly equipped him. As his medical file reported, he believed there had been a complete saturation of his entire being with the lasciviousness of over 20 years, during which time he had relations with thousands of nude women, night after night. The nightly dissipations had had no perceptible influence on his physical strength, but his organ had increased in size as the result of such constant use. Its constant priapism had allowed it to develop enormously. He remembered a Frenchwoman remarking "bien fait" on first seeing it. Another woman had called him an apostle of pleasure. Sexual adventure and fantasy gave him as much pleasure as anything else in the world. But when he became Christianized, he saw that he must sever himself from the lascivious life that he had been leading, and decided that the amputation of his penis would solve the problem. The surgical removal of the penis is at the best of times a dangerous practice, rarely performed even by doctors. An attack by the renowned Brazilian fishlet known as candiru, which likes to swim up a man's urine stream and lodge in the urethra, with a ring of retrorse spines preventing its removal, is one of the very rare circumstances in which doctors will perform the operation, known as pyotomy. It is a brave, foolhardy, and desperate man who will perform an autopyotomy, in which one removes one's own organ, the more so when the operation is done in an unsterile environment and with a penknife. Among his many perks, as we've seen, Dr. Miner had enjoyed, unlike all the other Broadmoor patients, the superintendent's permission to carry a penknife. It had long ceased to be of much use. Few were the occasions when he had to cut the unfinished pages of first editions, which is why he'd asked for the knife in the first place. Now it just sat in his pocket, as it might in that of an ordinary man on the outside world. Except that Miner was in no sense ordinary, and he now had, it turned out, an unusual and pressing need for the knife. He was desperately certain that it was his penis that had led him to commit all the unsavoury deeds that had so dominated his life. His continuing sexual desires, if not born in his penis, were at least carried out by it. In his delusional world he felt he had no alternative but to remove it. He was a doctor, of course, and so knew roughly what he was doing. So, on that Wednesday morning, he sharpened his knife on a whetstone. He tied a thin cord tightly around the base of his member to act as a ligature, and to pressure cauterize the blood vessels. He waited for 10 minutes or so, until the vein and artery walls had become properly compressed. And then, in one swift movement that most will prefer not to imagine, he sliced off his organ about 1 inch from its base. He threw the offending object into the fire. He relaxed the string and found that, as he had expected, there was almost no blood. He lay down for a while to ensure there was no hemorrhage, and then walked almost casually to the lower gate on the ground floor of Block 2, and called for the attendant. His training taught him he would probably now go into shock, and he supposed that he needed to be put into the asylum infirmary, as indeed the astonished Broadmoor doctors ordered. He remained there for the best part of a month, and within days was displaying his old cantankerous self, complaining at the noise the workmen were making, even though the day he chose to complain was a Sunday, when the workmen were all at home. The penis steadily healed, leaving a small stump through which Miner could urinate, but that, to his presumed satisfaction, proved to be useless sexually. The problem had been solved. The deity would be satisfied that no further sexual rompings could take place. The doctor remarked in his ward notes that he was amazed that anyone had had the nerve to perform such an extraordinary mutilation on himself. There remains one further possible reason for his having carried out so bizarre an act, a reason that some might think rather stretches credulity. He may have amputated his penis out of guilt and self-loathing for having enjoyed either some kind of relationship with, or lascivious thoughts about, the widow of the man he'd murdered. Eliza Merritt, it will be remembered, had visited Miner at the asylum at regular intervals in the early 1880s. She used to bring books and occasional gifts. He and his stepmother had given her money as recompense for her loss. She had said, quite publicly, that she had forgiven him for the murder. She had accepted, and sympathetically, that he had committed the crime while not knowing right from wrong. Might it not have been possible that in a moment of mutual consolation something passed between these two people, who were almost the same age, and who in many senses were similarly reduced in circumstances? And might it not be that one day, eventually, the memory of the event plunged the sensitive and thoughtful Dr. Miner into a deep and guilt-reddened depression? No suggestion exists that the meetings between Miner and Eliza Merritt were anything other than proper, formal, and chaste, and perhaps they always were so, and any residual guilt that Miner may have felt stemmed from the kind of fantasies to which his medical records show him to have been prey. But it has to be admitted that it remains a possibility, not a probability to be sure, that it was guilt for a specific act, rather than some slow-burning religious fervour that prompted this horrible tragedy. It was exactly a year afterward that the question of removing Dr. Miner to the United States was raised once more. This time his brother Alfred, who was still running the China Emporium back in New Haven, suggested it in a private letter to the superintendent, which Miner never saw. This time, and for the first time, the usually rebarbative Dr. Brain offered some grounds for hope. If arrangements could be made for his proper care and treatment, and if the American government would agree to his removal, I think it is quite possible that the proposal might be favourably considered. A year later still, and James Murray visited, on his way back home from seeing his daughter at college in London. He told Brain that Miner was "my friend," and said later he was distressed at how frail he seemed, at how the light and energy that had marked him in his dictionary-busy days of the previous decade seemed now to have deserted him. Murray was further convinced that the old gentleman must be allowed to go home to die. In England he had no one, and no work, no reason for existence. His life was merely a slow-moving tragedy, an act of steady dying conducted before everyone's eyes. William Miner repaid the pleasure of the visit in an unusually intimate way. He gave him a small amount of money. James Murray was going off to the Cape Colony, part of what is now South Africa, to attend a conference, and somehow Miner discovered that it was a journey that would stretch Murray's finances to the limit, though the normally parsimonious Oxford University Press delegates gave him £100. So Miner decided to pitch in as well, and sent out for a postal order for a few pounds, which he sent along with a curiously affectionate note, as one elder might write to another. "Pray pardon the liberty I take to enclose you a postal payable to your order, that I thought might add in a small way against unexpected demands upon your means. Even a millionaire may feel satisfaction to find he has a sovereign more than he thought for, though himself a republican, and we less gifted people have a right to a like satisfaction when the chance permits. Building a house and going on a journey are much the same, in costing more than one expects, and in any case I am sure you can make this useful. Now I will say good-bye to you both, with best wishes for your welfare, and in its uncontracted form also, God be with you. W.C. Miner." And over the succeeding weeks and months, the insane man became steadily the infirm man. He fell in his bath, he hurt his leg, he tripped and twisted leathery sinews and weary muscles. He suffered from the cold, and he caught a chill. All the casual inconveniences of old age were being piled onto his madness, each a Pelion upon Ossa, until William Miner was no more than a thin and elderly wretch, feared by no one, pitied by all. Then there came a pathetic example of a smaller madness. Though no longer much of a lexicographer or a flutist, Dr. Miner remained something of a painter, and filled many hours working at the easel set up in his room. One day, on a whim, he decided he would send one of his better works to the Princess of Wales, the young woman, May of Teck, Queen Mary to be, who was wife of the man who would soon become King George V. But Dr. Brain said no, bleakly and predictably enforcing the rule that no inmate at Broadmoor may communicate with any member of the royal family, a rule made because so many deranged inmates supposed themselves to be members of the royal family. He told Miner that he could not send it. The doctor, angry and querulous, then formally appealed, forcing Brain to send the painting and a petition to the Home Office, whose minister had the ultimate say. The office not unnaturally backed Brain, and Brain wrote again to Miner, denying his petition. But this caused Miner to get his dander up, and he wrote furiously and barely legibly to the American ambassador, asking that he use his good diplomatic offices to transmit the package to Buckingham Palace. The package was never sent. Brain insisted that he would not allow it. So Miner sent a further letter to the U.S. Army Chief of Staff in Washington, complaining that he, an officer in the U.S. Army himself, was being forcibly prevented from communicating with his embassy. The whole saga became then the focus of a long summer month's work by a host of attachés and vice-consuls and heads of protocol and assistants to senior staff officers, all bickering and wondering whether this harmless old man's doubtless charming watercolour could ever find its way into the hands of the Princess of Wales. But it never did. Permission was denied up and down the line, and the whole episode ended in a melancholy way. But when Dr. Minor sadly retreated to his cell block and asked plaintively for his painting back, he was informed with cold hauteur that it had in fact been lost. The letter asking for the painting back is in a spidery, shaky hand, the hand of an elderly, half-sane, half-senile man, and it was to no avail. The painting has never been recovered. And there were further dispiriting developments. In early March 1910, Dr. Brain, whom history will probably not judge kindly in the specific case of William Minor, ordered that all the old man's privileges be taken away. Minor was given just a day's notice to quit the suite of 2 rooms that he had occupied for the previous 37 years, to leave behind his volumes of books, to give up his access to his writing table, his sketch pads and his flutes, and move into the asylum infirmary. It was a cruel outrage committed by a vengeful man, quite likely jealous of the burgeoning reputation of his charge, and angry letters poured in from the few remaining friends who heard the news. Even Ada Murray, now Lady Murray since James had been knighted in 1908, recommended by a grateful Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, complained bitterly on her husband's behalf about the cruel and cavalier treatment that was apparently being meted out to the 76-year-old Minor. Brain replied limply, "I should not have curtailed any of his privileges had I not been convinced that to leave things as they were was running the risk of a serious accident." But neither Sir James nor Lady Murray was mollified. It was imperative, they said, that their scholar-genius friend now be allowed to go home to America, out of the clutches of this monstrous Dr. Brain, and away from a hospital that no longer seemed the benign home of harmless scholarship, but more closely resembled the bedlam it had once been constructed to replace. Minor's brother Alfred sailed to London in late March, with a view to resolving the situation once and for all. He had spoken to the U.S. Army in Washington. The generals there said it was possible, providing only that the British Home Office agreed, to have Dr. Minor transferred to the place in which he'd been incarcerated very many years before, St. Elizabeth's Federal Hospital in the American capital. If Alfred agreed to keep his brother in safe custody for the transfer across the Atlantic, then it might well be possible to persuade the Home Secretary to issue the requisite permission. Fate was to intervene in a merciful way. By great good fortune, the Home Secretary of the day was Winston Churchill, a man who, though less well known then than he would soon become, had a naturally sympathetic inclination toward Americans, since his mother was one. He ordered his civil servants to send a summary of the case up to his office, a summary that still exists, and offers a concise and intriguing indication of how governments manage their business. The various arguments for and against the parole of Dr. Minor are offered. The decision is deemed ultimately to rest only on whether, if Minor is still judged to be a danger to others, his brother Alfred can really be trusted to keep him away from firearms during any transfer. The bureaucrats working on the case then slowly but inexorably come to parallel understandings, that on the one hand Minor is not dangerous, and that on the other his brother could be well trusted if need be. So the recommendation made to Churchill on the basis of this turgid process of exposition and analysis was that the man should indeed be released on parole and allowed to go off to his native land. And so, on Wednesday, April the 6th, 1910, Winston S. Churchill duly signed, in blue ink, a warrant of conditional discharge, subject only to the condition that Minor shall on his discharge leave the United Kingdom and not return thereto. The next day Sir James Murray wrote, asking if he might be allowed to say goodbye to his old friend, and if he might bring Lady Murray as well. "There's not the least objection," said Dr. Brain smoothly, "and he is in much better health, and will be pleased to see you." One can almost hear the lifting of the old man's spirits, with the thought that after 38 long years he was finally going home. Since the occasion was a momentous one, both for Minor and for England, in more ways than could be immediately understood. Murray had invited an artist from Messrs. Russell and Company, photographers to His Majesty the King, to take a formal farewell portrait of Dr. Minor in the Broadmoor Asylum garden. Dr. Brain said he had no objection. The picture that resulted remains a most sympathetic portrait of a kindly, scholarly, and, from his facial expression, not uncontent figure, seemingly seated after tea under a peaceful English hedgerow, unconstrained, untroubled, careless of everything. At dawn on Saturday, April the 16th, 1910, Principal Attendant Spanholtz, a lot of Broadmoor attendants were, like him, Boer former prisoners of war, was ordered to proceed on escort duty in plain clothes to escort William Minor to London. Sir James and Lady Murray were there in the weak spring sun to say farewell. There were formal handshakes, and, it is said, the glistening of tears. But these were more dignified times than our own, and the two men who had meant so very much to each other for so long, and the creation of whose combined scholarship was now almost half complete. The 6 so far published volumes of the OED were packed securely in Minor's valise, said goodbye to each other in an air of stiff formality. Dr. Brain offered his own curt valedictory, and the landau rattled its way down the lanes, soon becoming lost to view in an early spring mist. 2 hours later it was at Bracknell Station, on the south-east main line to London. An hour later Spanholtz and Minor were at the mighty, vaulting Cathedral of Waterloo Station. Much larger than it had been when, no more than a few hundred yards away, the murder that began this story was committed on that Saturday night in 1872. The pair did not linger, for obvious reasons, but took a hansom cab to St. Pancras Station, and there caught the boat train to Tilbury Docks. They walked to the quayside, where the Atlantic Transport Line's twin-screw passenger liner SS Minnetonka lay, coaling and victualling, bound that afternoon for New York. It was only at Dockside that the Broadmoor attendant finally relinquished custody of his charge, handing him over to Alfred Minor, who was waiting beside the ship's gangway. A receipt was duly offered and signed, just before noon, as though the patient were just a large box or a haunch of meat. "This is to certify that William Chester Minor has this day been received from the Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum into my care," it read, and it was signed Alfred W. Minor, Conservator. Spanholtz then waved his own cheery goodbye and raced off to catch his return train. At 2 o'clock the vessel blasted a farewell on its steam horn, and, with tugs yelping, edged out into the estuary of the Thames. By mid-afternoon it was off the landmarked lighthouse on the Kentish coast's North Foreland, and had turned hard to starboard. By nightfall it was in the Channel, by dawn on the next fresh morning, south of the Scilly Isles, and by lunchtime all England and the nightmare that it enfolded had finally receded, lost, over the damp taffrail. The sea was grey and huge and empty, and ahead lay the United States and home. 2 weeks later Dr. Brain received a note from New Haven. "I am glad to say that my brother safely made the trip and is now pleasantly fixed in the St. Elizabeth's Asylum in Washington, D.C. He enjoyed the voyage very much and had no trouble from seasickness. I thought he walked about too much for the latter part of the voyage. He did not trouble me at night, though I felt much relief on arriving at the dock in New York. I hope I have the pleasure of meeting you at some future date. My regards to yourself and your family, and best wishes to all the Broadmoor staff and attendants." Chapter 11. The last chapter. Then only the monuments. Diagnosis, plural, OCs. From Latin, diagnosis, Greek, diagnosis, noun, of action. From diagnoskine, to distinguish, discern. From dia, through, thoroughly, asunder, plus gignoskine, to learn to know, perceive. In French, diagnose, in Molière. Compare Prec. 1. Med. Determination of the nature of a diseased condition, identification of a disease by careful investigation of its symptoms and history, also the opinion, formally stated, resulting from such investigation. Old Frederick Furnivall was the first of the great dictionary men to go. He died within just a few weeks of the Minnetonka's sailing from London. Furnivall had known he was dying since the beginning of that fateful year, 1910. He remained amusing and energetic to the end, sculling his little boat at Hammersmith, flirting with his waitresses at the ABC, sending his daily packages of words and newspaper clippings to the editor of a project with which he'd been intimately associated for all of half a century. He started one of his final letters to Murray with a typically eccentric disdain for the illness that he knew would shortly fell him. His first expressed interest was in a word, tallow catch, that Murray had found in Shakespeare, had recently defined, and had sent down to Hammersmith for approval. Furnivall offered his congratulations for a definition that read in part, "A very fat man, a tub of tallow," a word that has similarities today with the reference to a man as a tub of lard. Only after this did he speak elliptically of the grim prognosis his doctor had offered. He had intestinal cancer, remarking, "Yes, our dictionary men go gradually, and I am to disappear in 6 months. It's a great disappointment, as I wanted to see the dictionary finished before I die. But it is not to be. However, the completion of the word is certain, so that's all right." He died as predicted in July, but he did not abandon work until after inspecting, as Murray had suggested that he might, one majestically long entry that was due for inclusion in volume 11. "Would it give you any satisfaction," Murray had asked him, "to see the gigantic take in final before it is too late?" Murray himself, given his steadily advancing years, suspected that with Furnivall's passing his own end could not be too far off, and with offering take to Furnivall, it was evident he had only just begun the monumental work on the entirety of the letter T. That single letter was to take him 5 long years, from 1908 until 1913, to complete. When he finished, he was so relieved as to voice an incautiously optimistic forecast. "I've got to the stage where I can estimate the end. In all human probability, the Oxford English Dictionary will be finished on my 80th birthday, 4 years from now." But it was not to be. Neither was the OED to be completed in 4 years, nor was Sir James ever to become an octogenarian. The grand conjunction for which he hoped, his own golden wedding anniversary, his dictionary's completion, never happened. Oxford's Regius Professor of Medicine once joked that the university seemed to be paying him a salary just to keep that old man alive, so he can complete his work. They did not, it seems, pay enough. His prostate gave up on him in the spring of 1915, and the burning X-rays with which such problems were then treated hurt him severely. He kept up his pace of work, completing Trink to Turn Down in midsummer, and including many difficult words that, as a fellow editor said, were handled with characteristic sagacity and resource. He was photographed for the last time in the scriptorium on July the 10th, his staff and daughters around and behind him, and in the background shelves of bound books replacing the pigeonholes with their thousands of slips of paper, which had been the familiar backdrop in the dictionary's earlier days. His academic cap still atop his head, Sir James looks thin and weary. His expression is one of calm resignation. Those of the people beside him knowing and tragic. He died on July the 26th, 1915, of pleurisy, and was buried as he wished to be, beside a great Oxford friend who had been Professor of Chinese. William Minor, now into his 5th year at the Government Hospital for the Insane in Washington, D.C., which was known until 1916 only informally by its later permanent name, St. Elizabeth's, would have heard in due course of the death of the man who had brought him so much solace and intellectual comfort. But on the actual day of Murray's passing, he merely had yet another of the bad days that he was increasingly now enduring. Some might say that it was a day on which Miner in Washington was unknowingly in sympathy with the sad events that were unfolding in Oxford, more than 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean. "Struck one of his fellow patients," read the notes of Miner's Cherry ward for that same Monday evening, July the 26th. "He had happened to stop and look into his room, shows temper and will try to strike hard, but has little strength to hurt anyone." He'd started hitting people a month before. He went walking one June afternoon, along with his attendant, and the pair met a policeman. When the officer began to ask questions, Miner started pounding the attendant on the chest, though he later said he was sorry, explaining that he was becoming a little excitable. He'd probably been capable of inflicting little hurt from the moment he was first entered in the hospital log. He may have been mad, but he was painfully slender. His spine was bowed. He shuffled as he walked. He'd lost his teeth and had alopecia. Photographs were taken, full front and in profile, as if he were a common criminal. His beard is long and white, his bald head high and domed, his eyes wild. His madness was defined as simple paranoia, the doctors said. He admitted that he still thought constantly about little girls, and that he had dreams about the appalling acts they'd made him perform during his forced nightly excursions. But he was not regarded as dangerous. His doctors agreed that he should be granted the privilege of walking into the surrounding countryside, if accompanied by an attendant. The stump of his penis attested dramatically to the fact that he should not be allowed access either to a knife or to scissors, but otherwise he was deemed harmless. He was just a 77-year-old man, thin, toothless, wrinkled, slightly deaf, yet very active considering his age. His delusions steadily worsened during the St. Elizabeth's years. He complained that his eyes were regularly pecked out by birds, that people forced food into his mouth through a metal funnel, and then hammered on his fingernails, that scores of pygmies hid beneath the floorboards of his room and acted as agents for the underworld. He was occasionally irritable, but more usually quiet and courteous, and he read and wrote a great deal in his room. He had a somewhat arrogant air, said one doctor. He did not much care for the company of his fellow patients, and he would absolutely not let any one of them come into his private room. It was at St. Elizabeth's that his hitherto puzzling illness was given what might be regarded as its first modern, currently recognizable description. On November the 8th, 1918, his attending psychiatrist, a Dr. Davidian, formally declared that William Miner, federal patient number 18487, was suffering from what was to be called dementia praecox of the paranoid form. No longer was the vague word monomania to be used, nor would simple paranoia do. Miner and his case history had finally been cast off from the dubious moorings of the Victorians' puzzled but determinedly moral treatment of the mad. The phrase had been coined by the Frenchman Philippe Pinel of the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, and were at last to be welcomed into the world of modern psychiatry. The new phrase, dementia praecox, was quite precise. By the time Davidian employed it as a diagnosis, it had been current for 20 years. It literally meant early flowering failure of the mental powers, and was used to distinguish a condition in which a person begins to lose touch with reality, as Miner had done early on in his life, in his teens, his 20s, or his 30s. In this sense, the illness was markedly different from senile dementia, a term once used to describe the decrepitude that specifically accompanies old age, and of which Alzheimer's disease is one kind. The nomenclature was published in Heidelberg in 1899 by the German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin, who at the time was the supreme classifier of known mental ills. His naming of the condition was designed less to distinguish it from being an old person's ailment, as to mark it as very different from manic-depressive psychosis, an illness that had enough similarities to confuse the earliest of the alienists. Kraipelin's view, revolutionary at the time, was that while manic-depressive psychoses had identifiable physical causes, such as a low level of the alkaline metal lithium in the blood and brain, and were thus treatable, as with the use of lithium pills, for example, to make up a depressive's lack of it. Dementia praecox was a so-called endogenous ailment, quite lacking in any identifiable external cause. Dementia praecox was a so-called endogenous ailment, quite lacking in any identifiable external cause. In that respect, it was to be regarded as similar to such enigmatic systemic physical disorders as essential hypertension, in which a patient develops high blood pressure, and its many untidy and inconvenient side effects, for no obvious reason. Kraepelin went on to define 3 distinct subtypes of dementia praecox. There was catatonic, in which the motor functions of the body are either excessive or non-existent; epiphrenic, in which grotesquely inappropriate behavior begins during puberty, hence the word's origin from the Greek, hebe, youth; and paranoiac, in which the victim suffers from delusions, often of persecution. It was from this kind of dementia, according to Kraepelin's classification of the time, that Dr. Miner was suffering. The traditional treatment offered to him and his kind was still simple, basic, and by today's standards, dismayingly unenlightened. Those suffering from paranoid dementia were deemed pathologically incurable, were removed from society by court order, and were placed, kindly, tenderly for the most part, thanks to Pinel's powerful influence, in cells behind high walls, so as to cause no inconvenience to those living in the normal outside world. Some were incarcerated for only a very few years, some for 10 or 20. In the case of Miner, his involuntary exile from society was to last for most of his life. He existed for most of his first 38 years on the outside until he killed George Merritt. Then, for 47 of the 48 years that were left to him, he was locked away in the state asylums, essentially untreated because he was, in the view of the doctors of the day, essentially untreatable. Since the time of Miner and Davidian, the illness has become much more liberally regarded. Its name, for a start, has changed. What was initially the far less daunting word of schizophrenia, it came from the Greek for split mind, made its first appearance in 1912. It may change again, to rid the ailment of its patina of unpleasant associations. There are now moves, perhaps not entirely prudent, to have it called Kraepelin's syndrome. Early treatments for the disease, which were just being introduced at the time of Miner's final decline, involved the use of massive sedatives like chloral hydrate, sodium amytal, and paraldehyde. Today, entire shelves of costly antipsychotic drugs are available at least to treat and manage schizophrenia's more discomforting symptoms. But so far, and despite the spending of fortunes, there have been precious few advances in staying the mysterious triggers that seemingly set off the illness and its demonic mischiefs. And there continues to be much debate about what these triggers might be. Can it ever be said that a major psychological illness like schizophrenia, with its severe disruption of the brain's chemistry, appearance, and function, truly has a cause? In the case of William Miner, could the terrible scenes at the Battle of the Wilderness actually have triggered his florid behaviour? Might his branding of an Irishman have precipitated, led directly, or contributed even indirectly to the crime he committed 8 years later, which led to the exile he was to suffer for the remainder of his life? Was there ever an identifiable happening? Had he ever been exposed to the mental equivalent of an invading germ? Or is schizophrenia truly causeless, a part of the very being of some unfortunate individuals? Moreover, what is the illness? Is it simply the development of a personality that is several steps beyond mere eccentricity, and that steps into areas society does not find itself able to tolerate or approve? No one is quite certain. In 1984, a paper was presented describing a man who firmly believed himself to have 2 heads. He found one of them irritating beyond endurance, and shot at it with a revolver, injuring himself terribly in the process. He was diagnosed as schizophrenic, and the psychiatric community agreed, since it was manifestly certain that the man only had 1 head, and suffered from and was dominated by an absurd delusion. But then again, the notorious Mad Lucas, of Victorian Hertfordshire, who lived with his wife's dead body for 3 months, and then by himself, in wild biblical solitude and squalor for the next quarter-century, and was visited by coachloads of day-trippers up from London. He was diagnosed as schizophrenic too. Should he have been? Was he not merely a borderline eccentric, behaving in a fashion beyond the accepted norms? Was he as mad as the deluded owner of the phantom head? Was he as dangerous and as deserving of confinement? And how does a case like William Minor's sit within the spectrum of this madness? Was he less mad than the first man, and more so than the second? How does one quantify? How does one treat? How does one judge? Psychiatrists today remain cautious about all of these questions, and puzzled and argumentative about whether the illness can be triggered, does have a definable cause. Most academic psychiatrists hedge their bets, avoiding dogma, preferring simply to say that they believe in the cumulative effect of a number of factors. A patient may have a simple genetic predisposition to the illness, or characteristics of the person's basic temperament may similarly increase the likelihood that he or she will react badly or floridly to an external stress, to the sights of a battlefield, to the shock of a torture, for example. And then again, maybe certain sights and the shocks are too great or too sudden for anyone to endure them and remain wholly sane. There is the recently recognized condition known as post-traumatic stress disorder, which seems to affect inordinately large numbers of people who have been exposed to truly appalling situations. The only difference between their cases today, after the Gulf War, where it was first identified en masse, or after the trauma of a kidnap or a traffic accident, is that most sufferers are relieved of their symptoms after a period of time. But William Chester Minor never was. His agony endured for his entire life. However convenient it may be to say that post-traumatic stress ruined his life, and that of his victim, the continuing symptoms suggest otherwise. There was something wildly wrong with his brain, and what happened in Virginia probably prompted its more ruinous manifestations to emerge. Perhaps it was an unusual genetic make-up that predisposed him to fall ill. 2 of his relations had killed themselves, after all, though we're not certain of the circumstances. Maybe his gentle temperament — he was a painter, a flutist, a collector of old books — made him unusually vulnerable to what he saw and felt on those blood-soaked fields in the south. Maybe his subsequent imprisonment in Broadmoor then left him unimproved, when a more compassionate and enlightened regime might have mitigated his darker feelings, might have helped him recover. 1 in 100 people today suffer from schizophrenia. Nearly all of them, if treated with compassion and good chemistry, can have some kind of dignified life, of a kind that was denied for much of his time to Dr. Minor. Except, of course, that Minor had his dictionary work, and there is a cruel irony in this, that if he had been so treated, he might never have felt impelled to work on it as he did. By offering him mood-altering sedatives, as they would have done in Edwardian times, or treating him as today with such antipsychotic drugs as quetiapine or risperidone, many of his symptoms of madness might have gone away, but he might well have felt disinclined or unable to perform his work for Dr. Murray. In a sense, doing all those dictionary slips was his medication. In a way, they became his therapy. The routine of his quiet and cell-bound intellectual stimulus, month upon month, year upon year, appears to have provided him with at least a measure of release from his paranoia. His sad situation only worsened when that stimulus was gone, when the great book ceased to function as his lodestone, when the one fixed point on which his remarkable but tortured brain was able to concentrate became detached. So then he began to spiral downward, and his life began to ebb. One must feel a sense of strange gratitude, then, that his treatment was never good enough to divert him from his work. The agonies that he must have suffered in those terrible asylum nights have granted us all a benefit, for all time. He was mad, and for that we have reason to be glad, a truly savage irony on which it is discomforting to dwell. In November 1915, 4 months after Sir James had died, Dr. Minor wrote to Lady Murray in Oxford, offering her all the books that had been sent from Broadmoor to the scriptorium, and that had been in Sir James's possession when he died. He hoped they might eventually go off to the Bodleian Library. "I am glad to know that you are well, as I must presume from your letter and occupations. You must be taking or giving a great deal of labour for dictionary material still." He uses the English spelling of words. Clearly his years in Broadmoor had left their mark in more ways than the merely custodial. And his books do indeed rest in the great library to this day. They are registered as having been donated by Dr. Minor through Lady Murray. But by now he was failing steadily. An old colleague from Civil War days wrote from Winchester, Pennsylvania, to ask how his friend was, and the hospital superintendent replies that, considering his years, Captain Minor is in good health, and is in a bright and cheerful ward, where he seems contented with his surroundings. But the ward notes tell a different story, presenting as they do a litany of all the symptoms of the steady onset of senility and dementia. With increasing frequency the attendants write of Minor stumbling, injuring himself, getting lost, losing his temper, wandering, growing dizzy, tiring easily, and worst of all, beginning to forget, and knowing that he was forgetting. His mind, though tortured, had always been peculiarly acute. Now, by 1918 and the end of World War I, he seemed to know that his faculties were dimming, that his mind was at last becoming as weakened as his body, and that the sands were running out. For days at a time he would stay in bed, saying he needed a good rest. He would barricade the door with chairs, still certain he was being persecuted. It was more than 45 years since the murder, fully half a century since the first signs of madness had been noticed back at the Florida Army fort. And yet still the symptoms remained the same, persistent, uncured, incurable. Still came the occasional querulous note, such as this, written in the summer of 1917. "Dr. White, dear sir, there was a time when the meat, beef and ham, was very tough and dry. This has in a degree altered for the better since your note even, and I would not complain of that, and rice seemed to be the only vegetable with it. This is not much to complain of, and yet these trifles are much to us in this life. Thanking you for what you would wish to do, I am very truly yours, W.C. Minor." A year later, though his failing memory and eyesight cause him to date the letter 1819 rather than 1918, he shows another strange spurt of benevolence, similar to his contributing to James Murray's adventure to the Cape. In this latest case he sent $25 to the Belgian Relief Fund, and a further 25 to Yale University, his alma mater, as a donation to its military service fund. The president of Yale wrote back from Woodbridge Hall, "I have known much of Dr. Minor's history," he replied to the superintendent, "and am therefore doubly touched to receive this gift." In 1919 his nephew, Edward Minor, applied to the army to have him released from St. Elizabeth's and brought to a hospital for the elderly insane in Hartford, Connecticut, known as the Retreat. The army agreed. "I think if the Retreat fully understands the case, we should let him go," said a Dr. Duval at an October conference to discuss the matter. "He's getting so old now he will probably not do much harm." The hospital board agreed too, and in November, in a snowstorm, the frail old gentleman left Washington and the strange world of insane asylums, a world that he'd inhabited since 1872, for good and forever. He liked his new home, a mansion set in acres of woods and gardens on the banks of the Connecticut River. His nephew wrote in the early winter of 1920 of how the change seemed to have done him some good, and yet at the same time how incapable he was of looking after himself. Furthermore, he was fast going blind, and for some months had been unable to read. With this one overarching source of joy now denied to him, there must have seemed to him little left to live for. No one was surprised when, after a walk on a blustery early spring day in that same year, he caught a cold that turned into bronchopneumonia, and died peacefully in his sleep. It was Friday, March the 26th, 1920. He'd lived for 85 years and 9 months. He might have been mad, but like Dr. Johnson's dictionary elephant, he had been extremely long-lifed. There were no obituaries, just 2 lines in the deaths columns of the New Haven Register. He was taken down to his old hometown and buried in the Evergreen Cemetery on the afternoon of the following Monday, in the family plot that had been established by his missionary father, Eastman Strong, miner. The gravestone is small and undistinguished, made of reddish sandstone, and bears only his name, William Chester Miner. An angel stands on a plinth nearby, gazing skyward, with the engraved motto, "My faith looks up to thee." Around the Evergreen Cemetery a high chain-link fence keeps out an angry part of New Haven, well away from the stern elegance of Yale. The simple existence of the fence underlines a sad and ironic reality. Dr. William Miner, who was among the greatest of contributors to the finest dictionary in all the English language, died forgotten in obscurity, and is buried beside a slum. The Oxford English Dictionary itself took another 8 years to finish, the announcement of its completion made on New Year's Eve 1927. The New York Times put the fact on the front page the next morning, a Sunday, that, with the inclusion of the old Kentish word "sixt," the second indicative present tense in local argot of the verb to see, the work was done, the alphabet was exhausted, and the full text was now wholly in the printer's hands. The making of the great book, declared the newspaper roundly and generously, was one of the great romances of English literature. The Americans did indeed love the story of its making. H.L. Mencken, no mean lexicographer himself, wrote that he fully expected Oxford to celebrate the culmination of the 70-year project with military exercises, boxing matches between the dons, orations in Latin, Greek, English, and the Oxford dialect, yelling matches between the different colleges, and a series of medieval drinking bouts. Considering that the final editor of the book was dividing his time between professorships at both Oxford and Chicago, there was more than good reason for Americans to take a keen interest in a creation that was now, at least partly, of their own making. The lonely drudgery of lexicography, the terrible undertow of words against which men like Murray and Miner had so ably struggled and stood, now had at last its great reward. 12 mighty volumes, 414,825 words defined, 1,827,306 illustrative quotations used, to which William Miner alone had contributed scores of thousands. The total length of type, all hand-set, for the books were done by letterpress, still discernible in the delicately impressed feel of the inked-on paper, is 178 miles, the distance between London and the outskirts of Manchester. Discounting every punctuation mark and every space, which any printer knows occupy just as much time to set as does a single letter, there are no fewer than 227,779,589 letters and numbers. Other dictionaries in other languages took longer to make, but none was greater, grander, or had more authority than this. The greatest effort since the invention of printing, the longest sensational serial ever written. One word, and only one word, was ever actually lost. Bondmaid, which appears in Johnson's dictionary, was actually mislaid by Murray and was found, astray without a home, long after the fascicle Patently to Bosom had been published. It and tens of thousands of words that had evolved or appeared during the 44 years spent assembling the fascicles and their parent volumes, appeared in a supplement, which came out in 1933. 4 further supplements appeared between 1972 and 1986. In 1989, using the new abilities of the computer, Oxford University Press issued its fully integrated second edition, incorporating all the changes and additions of the supplements in 20 rather more slender volumes. To help boost sales in the late 70s, a 2-volume set in a much reduced typeface was issued, a powerful magnifying glass included in every slipcase. Then came a CD-ROM, and not long afterward the great work was further adapted for use online. A 3rd edition with a vast budget was in the works. There is some occasional carping that the work reflects an elitist, male, British, Victorian tone. Yet even in the admission that, like so many achievements of the era, it did reflect a set of attitudes not wholly harmonic with those prevalent at the end of the 20th century, none seem to suggest that any other dictionary has ever come close, or will ever come close, to the achievement that it offers. It was the heroic creation of a legion of interested and enthusiastic men and women of wide general knowledge and interest, and it lives on today, just as lives the language, of which it rightly claims to be a portrait. Postscript. Memorial. A and S.B. A, Old French, memorial, Modern French, mémorial, equals Spanish, Portuguese, memorial, Italian, memoriale. Adjective, Latin, memorialis. Adjective, neuter, memoriale, used in late Latin as SB. From memoria, memory. A, adjective. 1. Preserving the memory of a person or thing. 3. Something by which the memory of a person, thing, or event is preserved, as a monumental erection. This has been the story of an American soldier whose involvement in the making of the world's greatest dictionary was singular, astonishing, memorable, and laudable, and yet at the same time wretchedly sad. And in the telling it is tempting to forget that the circumstances that placed William Chester minor in the position in which he was able to contribute all his time and energy to the making of the OED, began with his horrible and unforgivable commission of a murder. George Merritt, who was his victim, was an ordinary, innocent, working-class farmer's son from Wiltshire, who came up to London to make his living, but who was shot dead, leaving a pregnant wife, Eliza, and 7 young children. The family was already living in the direst poverty, trying to maintain some semblance of their farm country dignity, amid the squalor of one of the roughest and most unforgiving parts of the Victorian city. With Merritt's murder, matters took a terrible turn for the worse. All London was shocked and horrified by the killing, and funds were raised and money collected to help the widow and her brood. Americans in particular, stunned by the outrage committed by one of their own, were asked by their consul general to contribute to a diplomatic fund. The vicars in Lambeth banded together to make collections ecumenically, a series of amateur entertainments, including one of an unusually high-class character, with readings of Longfellow and of a selection from Othello, and held at the Hercules Club, were staged across town to raise money, and the funeral itself was a splendid affair, as impressive as that of any grandee. George Merritt had been a member of the ancient order of foresters, one of the many so-called friendly societies that were once popular across Britain, as a means, in the absence of any government or privately funded schemes, of providing cooperative pensions and other financial help for the working classes. On the night he died, Merritt had been relieving a shift worker who was a brother forester. This small act of benevolence doubly obliged the order to offer its late member a handsome farewell. The cortege was half a mile long. The foresters' band, playing the Dead March from Saul, came first, then scores of emblem-wearing members, then the horse-drawn hearse, and 4 black mourning coaches to carry the bereaved. Eliza Merritt rode in the lead carriage, holding her youngest baby in her arms and sobbing. Hundreds of brewery workers followed, and then thousands of ordinary members of the public, all wearing black crape bands around their arms or hats. For the entire afternoon the procession wound from Lambeth, past the spot on Belvedere Road where the tragedy had occurred, past the Bedlam Hospital, and up to the vast cemetery at Tooting, where George Merritt was finally buried. His grave may once have been marked, but it lacks a marker now, and where the records say George Merritt lies, there is no more than a patch of discoloured grass, a tiny patch of settled earth among a sea of more nobler and newer monuments. As we have seen, in his lucid moments, William Minor was contrite, appalled by the consequences of his moment of mad delusion. From his cells at Broadmoor he saw to it that money was sent to the family to help them in their distress. His stepmother, Judith, had already arranged gifts for the children. Some 7 years after the tragedy, when Minor wrote to express his remorse, Eliza Merritt said that she forgave him, and she made what now seems the extraordinary decision to visit him in Broadmoor, and indeed for some months came down to Crowthorne frequently, and brought him packages of his beloved books. But she never really recovered from the shock of what had happened. Before long she'd taken to drink, and when she died it was of liver failure. 2 of her sons' lives then unravelled most curiously. George, the second oldest boy, took Judith's gift of money to Monaco, won a considerable sum, and remained there, styling himself the King of Monte Carlo before dying in impoverished obscurity in the south of France. His younger brother Frederick shot himself dead in London, for reasons that have never been fully explained. The fact that 2 of Minor's brothers also died by their own hand invests the entire story with almost more sadness than is bearable. But the principal tragic figure in this strange tale is the man who is the least well remembered, the one who was gunned down on the damp and cold cobblestones of Lambeth on that Saturday night in February 1872. The only public memorials ever raised to the 2 most tragically linked of this saga's protagonists are miserable, niggardly affairs. William Minor has just a simple little gravestone in a New Haven cemetery, hemmed in between litter and slums. George Merritt has for years had nothing at all, except for a patch of greyish grass in a sprawling graveyard in South London. Minor does, however, have the advantage of the great dictionary, which some might say acts as his most lasting remembrance. But nothing else remains to suggest that the man he killed was ever worthy of any memory at all. George Merritt has become an absolutely unsung man, which is why it now seems fitting, more than a century and a quarter on, that this modest account begins with the dedication that it does, and why this book is offered as a small testament to the late George Merritt of Wiltshire and Lambeth, without whose untimely death these events would never have unfolded, and this tale could never have been told. Author's note: Coda, musical, Italian, Latin, cauda, tale. A passage of more or less independent character introduced after the completion of the essential parts of a movement, so as to form a more definite and satisfactory conclusion. I first became intrigued by the central figure of this story, the dictionary itself, back in the early 1980s, when I was living in Oxford. One summer's day a friend who worked at the University Press invited me into a warehouse to look at a forgotten treasure. It was a jumbled pile of metal plates, each one measuring a little more than 7 inches by 10, and, as I found when I picked one up, as heavy as the devil. They were the discarded letterpress printing plates from which the Oxford English Dictionary had been made. The original, lead-fronted, steel and antimony-backed plates, cast in the 19th and early 20th centuries, from which all the many printings of the OED, from the individual fascicles made as the books were being edited, to the final 12-volume masterpiece of 1928, had been made. The press, my friend explained, had recently adopted more modern methods, computer typesetting, photolithography, and the like. The old ways of the letterpress men, with their slugs of lead, and their type-sticks, their M-quads and their brasses and coppers, their timpan paper and their platen brushes, and their uncanny ability to read backward and upside down at speed, were at long last being abandoned. The plates, and all the job cases of type for hand-setting, were now being tossed away, melted down, carried off. Would I perhaps like one or two of the plates, he asked me, just to keep as souvenirs of something that had once been rather marvellous? I chose 3 of them, reading the backward type as best I could in the dim and dusty light. 2 of them I later gave away, but I kept one. It was the complete page 452 of the Great Dictionary's Volume 5. It encompassed the words humoral to humour. It had been edited in 1901 or so, and set in type in 1902. For years I took that strange, dirty-looking old plate around with me. It was a kind of talisman. I would squirrel it away in cupboards in the various flats and houses in the various cities and villages in which I came to live. I was rather proud of it, boringly so, I dare say, and every so often I would find it hidden behind other, more important things, and I'd bring it out, blow off the dust, and show it off to friends, a small and fascinating item of lexicographic history. I'm sure at first they thought I was a little mad, though in truth I fancy they seemed after a while to understand my odd affection for the blackened, and so heavy, little thing. I would watch as they rubbed their fingers gently over its raised lead, and nod in mute agreement. The plate seemed to offer them some kind of tactile pleasure, as well as a simpler intellectual amusement. When I came to live in the United States in the mid-90s, I met a letterpress printer, a woman who lived in western Massachusetts. I told her about the plate, and she became visibly excited. She had a great enthusiasm for the story of the making of the dictionary, she said, as well as a tremendous fondness for its design, for the elegant and clever mix of typography and font sizes the stern old Victorian editors had employed. She asked to see my plate, and when I brought it to her, she asked if she might borrow it for a while. That while turned into 2 long years, during which time she took on as much other work as a hand printer gets these days. She embarked on a series of broadsides for John Updike, made chapbooks for a couple of other New England poets, published a collection or 2 of short stories and plays, all of which she had printed on handmade paper. She was very much the craftswoman, all her work meticulous, slow, perfect, and she kept my dictionary plate standing on a window-sill all the while, wondering what best to do with it. Finally she decided. She knew that I had a great liking for China, and had lived there for many years, and that I was also fonder of Oxford than any other English city. So she took down the plate, washed it carefully in a range of solvents to purge it of its accumulated dust, grease, and ink, mounted it on her Van der Cook-proof printer, and carefully pressed, on the finest hand-woven paper, 2 editions of the page, one inked in Oxford blue, the other in China red. She then mounted the 3 items side by side, the metal plate in the middle, the red page to the left, the other blue page to the right, and set them inside a slender gold frame behind non-reflecting glass. She left the completed picture, with wire and bracket for hanging it on the wall, in a small cafe in her hometown, and then wrote a postcard telling me to pick it up whenever I could, and at the same time to take care to enjoy the cafe owner's strawberry rhubarb pie and her cappuccino. There was no bill, and I've never seen the printer since. But the plate and its proof sheets hang on my wall still, above a small lamp that illuminates an open volume of the Great Dictionary on the desk below. It is volume 5, and I keep it open to the same page that was once printed from the actual piece of metal that hangs suspended just above it. It is what Victorians would have called a grand conjunction, and it serves as a small shrine to the pleasures of bookmaking and printing, and to the joy of words. Once my mother noticed that the dominant entry on the plate and the sheets and in the book below is the word humorist. It reminded her of a nicely droll coincidence. Another conjunction, though one rather less grand. Humorist had been the name of a horse that ran in the Derby on June the 1st, 1921, the day my mother was born. Her father, so pleased at the news of the birth of a baby girl, had put 10 guineas on the filly, rank outsider though she was. But she won, and a grandfather I never met made 1,000 guineas, all because of a word that briefly took his fancy. Acknowledgement. Also acknowledgement with an E after the G, a spelling more in accordance with English values of letters. From acknowledge, verb, plus meant, an early instance of meant added to an original English verb. 1. The act of acknowledging, confessing, admitting, or owning. Confession, avowal. 5. The owning of a gift or benefit received, or of a message, grateful, courteous, or due recognition. 6. Hence, the sensible sign, whereby anything received is acknowledged. Something given or done in return for a favour or message, or a formal communication that we have received it. 1739, T. Sheridan, Perseus, Dead 3. I dedicate to you this edition and translation of Perseus as an acknowledgment for the great pleasure you gave me. 1802, Mar Edgeworth, Moral T. 1816, 116, 133. To offer him some acknowledgment for his obliging conduct. 1881, Daily Telegraph, December the 27th. The painter had to appear and bow his acknowledgments. Maud. Take this as a small acknowledgment of my gratitude. When I first came upon this story, which was mentioned all too briefly, and just as an aside, in a rather sober book about the dictionary-making craft, it struck me immediately as a tale well worth investigating and perhaps telling in full. But for several months I was alone in thinking so. I had in the works a truly massive project, about an altogether different subject, and the advice from virtually all sides was that I should press on with that and leave this amusing little saga well alone. But 4 people did find it just as fascinating as I did, and saw also the possibilities that by telling the poignant and human tale of William Minor, I could perhaps create some kind of prism through which to view the greater and even more fascinating story of the history of English lexicography. These 4 people were Bill Hamilton, my long-time friend and London agent, Anya Waddington, my editor at Viking, also in London, Larry Ashmead, executive editor of HarperCollins in New York, and Marisa Milanese, then an editorial assistant in the offices of Condé Nast Traveller magazine, also in New York. Their faith in this otherwise unregarded project was total and unremitting, and I thank them for it unreservedly. Marisa, whom I think a paragon of ceaseless enthusiasm, dogged initiative, and untiring zeal, then went on to help me with the American end of the research. Together with my close friend of a quarter-century, Juliet Walker, in London, she helped me spin my basic ideas into a complex web of facts and figures, which I have since attempted to settle into some kind of coherent order. The extent to which I have succeeded or failed in this I cannot yet judge, but I should say here that these 2 women presented me with a bottomless well of information, and if I have misinterpreted, misread, misheard, or miswritten any of it, then those mistakes are my responsibility and mine alone. My thanks also to Sue Llewellyn, who, as well as copy-editing this book so assiduously, and with such good humour also, she reminded me, had worked on my book on Korea 10 years before. Access to Broadmoor Special Hospital, and to the voluminous files that have long been kept on all patients, was clearly going to be the key to cracking this story, and it took some weeks before Juliet Walker and I were allowed in. That we were was a triumph for 2 Broadmoor employees, Paul Robertson and Alison Webster, who made a persuasive case on our behalf to a perhaps understandably reluctant hospital administration. Without the help of these 2 remarkable and kind individuals, this book would never have managed to be much more than a collection of conjectures. The Broadmoor files were needed to provide the facts, and Paul and Alison provided the files. On the other side of the Atlantic, matters proceeded rather differently, despite the best efforts of the splendid Marisa. St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. is no longer a federal institution, but is run by the government of the District of Columbia, a government that has experienced some well-publicized troubles in recent years. And at first, perhaps because of this, the hospital refused point-blank to release any of its files, and went so far as to suggest, quite seriously, that I engage a lawyer and sue in order to obtain them. However, some while later, a cursory search I made one day of the National Archives pages on the World Wide Web suggested to me that the papers relating to Dr. Minor, who had been a patient at St. Elizabeth's between 1910 and 1919, when the institution was undeniably under federal jurisdiction, might well actually be in federal custody, and not within the Kafkaesque embrace of the district. And indeed, as it turned out, they were. A couple of requests through the internet, a happy conversation with the extremely helpful archivist Bill Breach, and suddenly more than 700 pages of case notes and other fascinating miscellanea arrived in a FedEx package. It was more than gratifying to be able to telephone St. Elizabeth's the next day and tell the unhelpful officials there which file I then had sitting before me on my desk. They were not best pleased. The Oxford University Press was, by contrast, wonderfully helpful, and while I'm naturally happy to thank the officials at the Press who so kindly sanctioned my visits to Walton Street, I wish to acknowledge the very considerable debt that I owe first to Elizabeth Knowles, now of Oxford Reference Books Department, who had made a study of Minor some years before, and was happy to share her knowledge and access with me. I'm delighted also to be able to thank the irrepressibly enthusiastic Jenny McMorris of the Press Archives, who knows Minor and his remarkable legacy more intimately than anyone else anywhere. Jenny, together with her former colleague Peter Foden, proved a tower of strength during my visits and long after. I only hope that she manages to find an outlet for her own fascination with the great Dr. Henry Fowler, whom she rightly regards, along with Murray, as one of the true heroes of the English language. Several friends, as well as a number of specialists who had a professional interest in parts of the story, were kind enough to read the manuscript's early drafts, and they made many suggestions for improving it. In almost all cases I have accepted their proposals with gratitude, but if on occasion I did, through carelessness or pig-headedness, disregard their warnings or demands, then the same caveat about the responsibility for all errors of fact, judgment, or taste remaining firmly with me applies as well. They did their best. I'm indebted also to my American agent, Peter Matson, his colleague, Jennifer Hengen, and to Agnes Krupp, who, once enthused by the strange nature of this story, became among its keenest supporters, and kept me going, writing hard, during a long, hot American summer. My wife Catherine saw to it that I remained undisturbed, and offered generously the kind of serenity and sanctuary that the writing of a yarn like this more than amply deserves. This concludes the reading of The Professor and the Madman by Simon Winchester. This book was read by David Case.